Hi, and welcome to Check Your Thread, a podcast about sewing more sustainably. My name's Zoe, and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 13 years and am the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me on this journey. Hello, lovely people. Thanks for checking out the 4th episode of the Check Your Thread podcast. I hope you've had a good week and that your sewing projects have been bringing you joy and your sustainability goals have been working out well for you. I've had a crazy busy week. I've been doing some extra hours at my part-time job, plus the kids are still on their summer holidays. However, I have managed to finish my linen trousers. Woohoo! Someday I may get round to taking some photos of them, but I can't see that happening for a while, to be honest. I used some lovely slubby navy linen with white flecks that I bought at Fabric Godmother and the Arden Pants pattern by Helen's Closet, which I was given for free. They feel fantastic to wear, I'm pleased to report, and I've worn them most days since I finished them. My only issue with them is that I'm not sure if they should sit fairly high up around my belly button or if they're meant to sit lower around my upper hip area. If I decide on the higher position, I think I'm going to have to unpick the stitching that I did through the elastic around the waistband and tighten up the elastic, because they currently fall down on my hips anyway, especially when I put my phone in my pocket. But the fabric is such great quality, I expect that these trousers are going to be in use for years and years, so it's totally going to be worth finding the patience and going back in to adjust them. So sustainability-wise, I'm desperately waiting for the tomatoes on my mini tomato plants to turn red so I can stop buying tomatoes in plastic packaging. Baby plum tomatoes are one of the very few types of fruit and veg that my son will eat, and we get through a ton of them. And sadly, the plastic trays that they come in aren't recyclable in my area, so they end up going to landfill, which feels awful. So I can't wait until we are tomato self-sufficient for a month or so. Right, back to the podcast. Massive thanks to Tori for becoming a patron of Check Your Thread over on Patreon this week. If you'd like to support the show and feel you can afford it, you could do so by committing to the cost of a cup of coffee each month. So please follow the link to the Patreon in the show notes or on the website checkyourthread.com. So whilst you're on the Check Your Thread website, why not sign up to the newsletter? As soon as my kids start back at school, I'm going to fire off the first of what will become monthly newsletters, so make sure you're signed up in advance. It's going to include extra chat and sneaky peeks into forthcoming episodes and lots more. So this episode is a solo one. It's clear that making the most of the fabric that we buy is fundamental to keeping our craft as sustainable as possible. So in this episode, I'm making a case for keeping and using your scraps and leftovers. And I'm going to run through my favourite uses for scraps and leftovers. Okay, let's do this. If you've been sewing for even a little while, you'll have started to generate scraps and pieces that are left over from cutting out your projects. So if you don't already keep hold of your scraps and leftovers, I'm hoping that this episode will convince you to keep hold of at least some of them. Now, I totally understand that fabric scraps and leftovers can get pretty overwhelming, especially if you don't have much or any dedicated sewing space in your home. You may feel tempted to chuck out everything left over from a sewing project so that you've got a clean slate ready for your next. However, they are in themselves a fantastic resource that can be used in so many different ways and for so many different projects. Here's why you should consider saving and using them. So firstly, using scraps and leftovers rather than chucking them out makes the full use of the energy and resources that went into the production and processing of the fabric in the first place. Secondly, working leftover fabrics into new projects allows you to get even more enjoyment from the gorgeous fabric pieces that you already love. Thirdly, using scraps and leftovers as the basis of some of your projects will lessen the demand for new virgin textiles. And last but not least, it'll save you money, meaning that you can have lots more sewing fun even during the times when you can't justify spending any money on fabric. If you need even more convincing, please listen back to episode 2 of this podcast where I spoke to Wendy Ward. She's a passionate collector of leftovers and shared many ideas for using scraps in that episode that appear in her new book. So today I'm going to list and talk about my personal 5 favourite uses for fabric scraps and leftovers. So see if you can guess what they are and have a quick think about what your favourite scrap busting uses are. So for the purposes of this episode, I'm defining leftovers as pieces of fabric smaller than 1/2 metre, including all the weird shaped bits you often end up after cutting out your project. As you can tell, I'm a massive advocate for hanging on to your fabric scraps and leftovers if possible. But as someone who shares their sewing space in my family's dining area, I completely understand that for most people, it's impossible to save every piece of scrap that you generate. So as Wendy suggested in episode 2, please consider donating any scraps or leftovers that you know you're not going to use to a school or nursery or something, or see if there's some kind of scrap collection and redistribution endeavour around where you live. Any pieces that you deem too tiny to use can be fantastic for stuffing, so consider making a floor cushion or the closet core poof pattern, which effectively becomes a useful bin for all the tiny pieces. If the above ideas aren't an option for you, then please bag up your scraps, write on the bag in permanent marker that it contains fabric scraps, and pop it into a textiles recycling charity collection bin. Please, please, please never put fabric scraps in a bin heading for landfill. Right, on to the projects. Hopefully my waffle has given you a chance to think about your own fabric scrap projects, or to guess what mine are. Right, let's go. Okay, so these are in no particular order. My first favourite use for scraps and leftovers is sun hats. Let me convince you. So surely there are very few places on earth where a sun hat won't be useful at some point during the year. So I don't know why, but for the best part of a decade, I seem to make at least 2 sun hats every year, either for somebody in my immediate family or for a friend who needs one. They're such a good gift as well, if you can find out the size of the person's head, of course. Sun hats are good for using up leftovers of canvas, twill, denim, even upholstery fabric for the outers. Basically fabric that will hold their shape well to create a more structured hat. I like to use leftovers of woven cotton like quilting cotton or Ankara for the lining. You could experiment and have fun by making them reversible as well. If you're going for a floppier look, you could try linen or linen blends. And brims can always be strengthened with interfacing and doing rows of top stitching around the brim, which magically stiffens the brims whilst also looking super profesh. At Crystal Tips on Instagram has made an awesome bucket hat from scraps of fabric, all in different shades of blue that looks really fantastic. She's shown that even small pieces of fabric can be joined together to make a great looking hat. If you don't want the whole hat to be pieced or patchworked together, maybe you could do that just for the lining and keep the outer one a solid colour. My favourite patterns for making sun hats are the Oliver & S bucket hat, which is kids sizing up to approximately 8 years old, and the Sorrento bucket hat by LB Textiles, which is really good because she donates all the proceeds from the sales of those hats to really good causes. Another similar kind of hat with a wider brim is the Serpentine hat, also by LB Textiles. And there's a couple of other great free bucket hat patterns that I personally haven't tried, but they look really good. So Waves and Wild, which is formerly made by Jack's Mum Pattern Company, they have a fantastic looking bucket hat that goes from kids all the way up to adults, I believe. And Liz Hayward also has a free bucket hat as well. So I'm going to include links to all of those in the show notes. Scrap busting project number 2 is undies. So I bet you saw this one coming. So undies are such a great way to use up scraps of lighter weight jersey fabric. It doesn't really matter what the fabric looks like, whether you're using up some fabric that you don't love the colour of, or you're using a wild print that maybe you wouldn't wear as regular visible clothing. Most people aren't even going to see them, so you can just go wild, and it's a great way to use up all those bits of fabric. And if the finish of the undies isn't really the best, it totally doesn't matter. So it's a great way to practice using stretch fabric and undie elastic and really hone your skills in a way that you're still making something useful, but it doesn't have to look amazing. Comparatively speaking, they're a super quick project, so you could batch sew a whole undie drawers load in one go, or you could just make a pair or two as a pleasing palette cleanser in between more complex sewing projects. You can also go to town experimenting with trims and finishes if you wish. If the pattern pieces don't quite fit on your scraps and leftovers, consider seaming the pieces together either by using the same fabric or a cool combo of different fabrics so that you've patched together a piece that's big enough to get your pattern pieces on. So the pattern that I always use for making undies for myself is, surprisingly, my own free undies pattern, which you can get on my blog. Sozo What Do You Know? I'll put a link in the show notes, which is graded between 32-inch hip and 50-inch hip. There aren't many undies patterns that include teen sizing, so if you know anyone who wants to make things for their teens, or even for teens themselves that want to try, please direct them to my pattern. But there are so many other free and paid for undies patterns out there if you're looking for a different style or size. I've also had fun using the Waves and Wild Wonder Undies pattern, making undies for my friend. The shape doesn't quite work out for my bum, but many people swear by that pattern. It's also a great pattern because if you can also use even more scraps when you choose the fabric band option rather than elastic for finishing the waistband and the leg holes. For making undies for kids, I use the Waves and Wild pattern, which is called the Speedy Pants, and that is also available for free. I feel like I mention that pretty much every other post on Instagram because I just think it's fantastic. It includes both briefs and boxer styles, and I've adapted the brief style to be a bit more suitable for my daughter, so I actually use that pattern for both my kids. It uses fabric for the bands of the waist edge and the legs hole finishing as well, so once again that's a great way to use up even more scraps of fabric, and you can have lots and lots of fun creating wild colour and pattern combos as well. For guys, Waves and Wild also have a men's boxer pattern that I've bought but I've yet to try, and Canadian menswear pattern brand Thread Theory have a very popular boxers pattern called the Comox Trunks, which I've heard is very good. When it comes to fabric type, personally, I generally use scraps of like cotton, lycra, /elastane, /spandex blend single jersey for my undies. But I recently tried some dead stock viscose poly blend jerseys that I was given from the Etsy shop Craft and Thrift. And I must admit that the comfort levels of those undies is through the roof. So if you're hoarding a variety of jersey scraps, I really think you should just feel free to experiment with all the different types to see what you prefer. Reusing unwanted garments can also be an option, but please remember that fabric that has a 4-way stretch rather than a 2-way stretch are going to feel more comfy. So by that I mean that the fabric will stretch when you stretch it both across the fabric and up and down. And if you want to play around with synthetic knits or power net or mesh or lace fabrics, I definitely recommend using a piece of cotton jersey for the gusset piece. Okay, my third favourite use for scraps and leftovers is kids' clothes. So if you've ever chanced upon my blog or my personal Instagram feed, you will have seen this one coming. So I have 2 youngish children and I've been making clothes for them since pretty much before they were born. Most of the things I make for them are actually made from leftovers from adult sewing projects or reusing the fabric from unwanted garments. Very occasionally will I buy some fabric specifically to sew them something. Obviously, the smaller the baby or child, the more options you've got because the pattern pieces will fit onto smaller scraps. If you're looking for some great looking patterns for babies and toddlers that would be great for using up leftovers, I could recommend the Harem Pants pattern by Wixton for lightweight wovens like cotton, lawn or double gauze. The Bummies pattern by Brindle and Twig, which is a free pattern for creating nappy covers from scraps of jersey. The Ringer Tee pattern is another free pattern by Brindle and Twig that uses jersey fabric, and it also uses strips of fabric for the neck binding, finishing the sleeves, and for the waistband, so that's even more opportunities to use up scraps of fabric. Plus there are heaps of patterns and tutorials out there for making useful little things like dribble bibs and baby hats and so forth. Whatever the size of the child that you're making for, don't forget that fabric can be pieced together. Some sewing patterns for kids' clothes already include a lot of seams, so using up a mix of leftovers is made even easier. Masusu Patterns is a fantastic sewing pattern company that have some really wonderful sewing patterns for kids that are begging to be made from wild combos of leftovers. But you can piece together fabric yourself if your leftovers are too small for the pattern pieces. Right now, I'm feeling an entire episode on sewing more sustainably for kids coming on, so I'm going to leave this section here for now. So my fourth favourite use for leftovers and scraps is actually the one that's exciting me the most at the moment, and it is pieced or patchworked garments. So when I think of the term patchwork garments, I instantly conjure up a picture of a pair of patchwork dungarees that my best friend had in the 90s. She bought them in one of those shops that sells a lot of candles and joss sticks, you know. But these days there are so many amazing examples of clothes that have been made from combining scraps of fabric. So So I touched on this obviously in the kids wear bit I just mentioned, but I want to talk about it a bit more broadly now, and I think it deserves its whole separate section. Basically, the general idea is to join small pieces of fabric together until you have a collection of larger shapes that are big enough to cut your pattern pieces out of. So when you're selecting which scraps and leftovers to put together, first you kind of need to decide whether you plan to simply seam the pieces together to make the bigger shape, or if you plan to stitch the scraps down onto another piece of fabric to give them more stability or more body. So you may want to do the latter if you're making a coat or bag or hard-wearing cushion perhaps, something that needs quite a lot of strength and resilience. The seaming option is going to be more suitable for most garment projects, as well as loads of different household applications as well. So generally, if you're planning to seam pieces together, I've kind of found generally that it makes more sense to combine pieces that have a similar kind of behaviour. So for example, finding fabrics that have a similar kind of weight or a similar kind of drape or lack of drape, if you see what I mean. So for example, I made a woven t-shirt using the Grainline Studios Scout Tee pattern by combining lots of leftovers of viscose and tencel, so fabrics that are quite lightweight, have a lot of drape. I've also made a tiered maxi dress for my daughter by combining rectangles of very slinky jerseys that I thought were too thin and not really suitable for undies making. So the jury is slightly out on whether or not you want to kind of consider what's going on with the grain lines of your fabric. I would say, as a rule, if the fabric is very slinky or drapey, or it's very stretchy, it's a good idea to try and make sure that you're roughly keeping the grain lines going parallel with each other. I know that can be tricky because often, like if you're using scraps and leftovers, you've cut the selvages off, but often if you look quite closely at fabric, you can get a kind of idea of where the grain line is. You can probably get away with ignoring the grain line if you're using fabrics that don't have too much stretch or too much drape. So for example, like sweatshirt fabric or denim, you can probably get away with being a bit more loosey-goosey with that. So you want to kind of consider your colour palette. If, like me, you have quite a limited kind of colour palette that you tend to sew from anyway, you might find that you can come up with a colour combo quite easily from the scraps you've had left over from previous projects. But really kind of just play around with choosing scraps and putting them together and seeing whether or not you can create like a nice combo. Or you could do like Crystal Tips did, as I mentioned before, with her bucket hat. Just use shades of one particular colour. When it comes to combining woven fabrics, generally I find it easier to create squares and rectangles from the scraps and leftovers to combine them, just so I find it a bit easier to seam fabric in that way. But when I recently made some kind of pretty crazy scrap busting t-shirts for my husband and my daughter, that was using single jersey. So for those, I didn't create squares or rectangles out of my scraps first. What I did is I just kind of took each scrap and then I took my rotary trimmer and a set square and I just straightened up the edges that I planned to stitch together so that the seams were straight, but the pieces themselves were all sorts of odd, bizarre kind of shapes, which meant I actually managed to come up with very little waste that way. I know that Lauren from LB Textiles has written a really good blog post about piecing together fabric to create garments. So I'll create a link to that in the show notes also for extra information. I've also been collecting lots of examples of this that particularly inspire me on a Pinterest board. So I will make sure I link to that as well. So we come to number 5 of my favourite uses for scraps and leftovers. Probably one of the most obvious, arguably, uses of scraps and leftovers, and it's when you save bits of fabric to use for pocket bags and facings and lining certain sections of a garment. So it's a great idea to keep scraps and leftovers for this particular purpose, because there's lots of times when you're cutting out a garment, if you were to cut the pocket bags, for example, or the lining of the waistband or the lining of the yoke or something from the fabric that you're using for the rest of the garment, those bits are going to end up a bit too thick. So that might make the garment a little bit bulky and uncomfortable to wear, or it might mean that there's certain things, for example, like the pocket bag, that will become visible from the outside if you're using a kind of heftier fabric. So generally for this kind of use, you're going to be wanting to save things like lighter weight cottons, things like cotton lawn, maybe poplin, shirting, gingham, quilting cotton, scraps of lining fabric, of course. Even slinky wovens like viscose or tencel can actually be used for this kind of thing. So what I really love about this is that not only are you not having to buy a brand new piece of lining fabric and you're using stuff that you've already got, but also it gives a kind of really kind of high-end kind of individual look, because you'll just have a pop of something, maybe a contrast colour or a cool print or something, and that just gives it a kind of elevated look to your garment. Personally, I really love using scraps of wash denim and chambray for this as well, because I just think that those kind of lighter weight denim-y kind of fabrics look so good with so many other fabrics. So I really like to see a little pop of that inside my garments. So I think that that's about it. There's actually heaps of other ways I like to use scraps and leftovers of fabric, but those are definitely my top 5. So please let me know. Were any of your favourites the same as mine? Are there any other uses that you find that you use things for? Maybe you're a quilter and leftovers from garment projects become an amazing resource for your quilts. So please let me know what your favourite uses for scraps and leftovers are. So please either find me on Instagram at checkyourthread or email me, zoe@checkyourthread.com. I know this is a topic that we're going to come back to again, so it would be really fun to create an episode that includes everybody else's favourite ideas. So do get in touch. Remember, all the links of everything that I mentioned will be in the show notes, and you can find those at checkyourthread.com. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!